The phone rang at 6:17 p.m., cutting through the silence I'd wrapped around myself like a familiar blanket. Deputy Martinez's voice carried that particular hesitancy I'd learned to recognize. The tone people use when they need help but aren't sure they should be asking for it. "Dr. Carver, I've got a situation out by the old water tower. There's a dog here, limping pretty bad. But he won't let anyone near him. He just stares at us, you know?" I was already turning off the lights in my clinic, already mentally preparing for the drive home to an empty house that still smelled like my husband's coffee, even though Tom had been gone for exactly 1 year today. The anniversary sat heavy in my chest, a weight I'd been carrying since morning, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with another broken thing that needed fixing. But something in Martinez's voice made me pause with my hand on the door handle. Maybe it was the way he said stairs, like it meant something more than just looking. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I heard myself saying. The water tower sits on a hill overlooking our small Texas town, a rusted sentinel that's been there since before I was born. As I pulled up in my truck, headlights cutting through the dusk, I could see Martinez standing near his patrol car, gesturing to someone on his radio. And there, at the base of the tower, was the dog. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to know something. Can you tell me in the comments where you're watching from? Your country? Your city? Sometimes when I'm dealing with cases that don't make sense, I wonder if there are others out there who've seen things that challenge everything we think we know about the world. The dog was medium-sized, maybe 60 pounds, with a gray coat that seemed to absorb the fading light rather than reflect it. He was holding his right front paw slightly raised, not quite touching the ground, the careful posture of an animal protecting an injury. But it was his stillness that struck me first. Most strays are nervous, constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. This one just sat there, patient as stone, watching my approach with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Hey there, boy," I called softly, crouching down about 10 feet away. That's when he did something that stopped my heart for a full beat. He stood up, took 3 deliberate steps toward me, and gently rested his head against my outstretched hand. Not the desperate gratitude of a rescued animal, but the measured greeting of someone who'd been waiting for me specifically. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue-gray and far too intelligent. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. Not through me or past me, but directly into me, like he was reading information I didn't know I was broadcasting. I loaded him into my truck without resistance. He settled into the passenger seat like he'd ridden there before, never taking those strange eyes off my face. The drive back to the clinic was silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the sound of my own heartbeat, which seemed unusually loud in the enclosed space. At the clinic, I ran through my standard intake procedure. No collar, no tags, no microchip when I scanned him. His body condition was good despite being a stray. Clean teeth, healthy weight, coat that showed signs of regular grooming. The only obvious issue was the limp, which was consistent and pronounced, but didn't seem to cause him any distress. I named him Solace, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. The name just felt right, like it had been waiting in my throat for him specifically. In retrospect, I think I knew even then that he was going to change something fundamental about my carefully constructed solitude. I scheduled an X-ray for the following morning, expecting to find a simple fracture or maybe a thorn embedded in his paw pad. Instead, I discovered something that would turn my understanding of biology, and reality itself, completely upside down. But that first night, before I knew what was hidden inside his leg, Solace began displaying behaviors that should have warned me I was dealing with something beyond ordinary veterinary medicine. He positioned himself by the back door of the clinic and stood there for hours, absolutely motionless, with his tail rigid and ears trained toward something I couldn't see or hear. When I tried to coax him away, he would move just far enough to appease me, then return to his post the moment I turned my back. He refused to eat from the bowl I'd placed in the kennel area, but when I moved it beneath the examination table in the main room, he ate normally. At first I thought it was just anxiety about the unfamiliar space, but his behavior was too specific, too purposeful for simple stress. Most disturbing was his reaction to the clinic's antique wall clock. Every time it chimed the hour, something I'd long since stopped noticing, Solace would flinch violently, his whole body contracting like he'd been struck. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like the sound was familiar in all the wrong ways. The X-ray the next morning changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible. I'd expected to see bone, maybe some soft tissue swelling, possibly a foreign object like a piece of glass or metal. What the imaging revealed made me stare at the screen for a full 5 minutes, certain that the machine had malfunctioned or that I was looking at the wrong file. Embedded deep within the bones and soft tissue of Solace's right front leg was a structure unlike anything in my 15 years of veterinary practice. It was dense, spiral-shaped, approximately 6 inches long, and perfectly symmetrical. The spiral extended upward from just below his paw, wrapping delicately around the radius and ulna bones, threading between nerves and blood vessels with surgical precision, and terminating just before the shoulder joint. But here's what made my hands shake as I adjusted the imaging controls. It wasn't disrupting the surrounding tissue. Instead, it seemed to be integrated with it, as if it had grown there. The bone had remodeled around it. The nerves had rerouted to accommodate it, and the blood vessels had formed new pathways that included it in their network. Whatever this thing was, it belonged there in a way that defied everything I knew about anatomy and physiology. And if stories like this move your heart the way they move mine, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what I discovered next. Because what happened when I tried to get answers about that X-ray would convince me that some mysteries are more dangerous than ignorance. I called Dr. Sarah Patel, a radiologist I'd worked with during my residency, someone I trusted to be discreet about unusual cases. I sent her the images under a false patient ID, claiming it was a complex fracture case I needed a second opinion on. Sarah called me back within an hour, her voice tight with confusion and something that sounded like fear. "Helena, I've been looking at these images for 45 minutes and I need to ask you something. What kind of animal did you say this was?" "A dog. Mixed breed, maybe 60 pounds. Long pause. "Helena, this isn't a dog. Or at least, not entirely. The bone density is wrong. The neural pathways don't match any mammalian structure I've ever seen. And that spiral thing? I've run it through every database I have access to, and there's nothing even close. This looks more like some kind of hybrid anatomy. Like something was designed rather than evolved." After I hung up, I sat in my empty clinic staring at Solace, who was lying calmly in the corner, watching me with those unsettling pale eyes. He tilted his head when I looked at him, and I swear he almost seemed to be smiling. That's when the changes really began. Over the next few days, Solace's limp gradually disappeared. His movements became more fluid, more purposeful, like an athlete returning to peak condition after injury. But it wasn't just physical improvement. His entire presence seemed to sharpen, to become more focused and aware. He began pacing the clinic at night, not randomly but in specific patterns that I started to map out of curiosity. The paths he traced formed geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, symbols that looked almost like writing in a language I'd never seen. When I tried to interrupt his pacing, he would wait patiently for me to move, then resume exactly where he'd left off. He started reacting to sounds and events before they happened. His head would lift and turn toward the front door a full 30 seconds before anyone knocked. He would position himself near the electrical panel minutes before the power flickered. Once, he began whimpering and pawing at my leg insistently until I followed him outside, just as a tree branch crashed down exactly where I'd been standing. But it was the dreams that convinced me something fundamental had shifted in my reality. Every night, I found myself walking through the same vivid landscape, a long, curved hallway with walls that seemed to pulse with their own light. The surfaces were smooth, organic, more grown than built. Along both sides of the corridor were what looked like containment cells, but instead of bars or doors, they were sealed with some kind of energy field that shimmered like heat waves. In these dreams, Solace walked ahead of me, completely at ease in the strange environment. He would pause at certain cells, looking inside with what seemed like recognition or sadness. Sometimes I could see shapes moving within the energy fields, not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between. I would wake from these dreams with the absolute certainty that I hadn't been asleep at all, that I'd been somewhere real and important and dangerous. When I started finding my clinic rearranged in the mornings, surgical instruments moved to different drawers, files reorganized in patterns I didn't recognize, a locked cabinet standing open with its contents carefully rearranged, I knew the dreams and reality were bleeding into each other. But it was the mark burned into the wall of my imaging room that made me realize I was dealing with forces I couldn't begin to understand. If you're feeling this moment the way I did when it happened, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. It means more than you know, because what I discovered next would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between science and something far more mysterious. I found it on a Thursday morning, etched into the wall behind my X-ray machine, like it had been burned there with precise, controlled heat. A spiral pattern, about 8 inches tall, identical in every detail to the structure embedded in Solace's leg. The wall around it was unmarked, undamaged, as if the image had simply materialized there overnight. That same afternoon, a woman came into my clinic. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the kind of neutral appearance that makes people instantly forgettable. She didn't introduce herself or explain why she was there. She simply walked up to my reception desk and said, "I understand you've been taking some interesting X-rays recently." Every instinct I had screamed danger. "I'm sorry, but patient information is confidential. If you're not the owner of an animal in my care, I can't discuss any cases with you." She smiled, a perfectly pleasant expression that somehow made my skin crawl. "Dr. Carver, I work in biological anomaly recovery. The animal you're currently housing wasn't meant to be found by civilian personnel. I'm here to correct that oversight." "I don't know what you're talking about." She reached into her purse and placed a small white card on my counter. It was blank except for a single mark in silver ink. A fingerprint, but not quite human. The ridges and whorls formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. "When you're ready to discuss this professionally," she said, "call the number on the back." I flipped the card over. It was blank. After she left, I locked the front door and called the sheriff's department. They had no record of anyone matching her description, and no agency called Biological Anomaly Recovery in any of their databases. It was as if she'd never existed at all. That night, I made the decision to take Solace home with me. He followed me up the stairs to my bedroom without hesitation, settling at the foot of my bed like he'd always slept there. For the first time since Tom's death, I didn't feel alone in my own house. But it wasn't just companionship. It was the overwhelming sense that something sacred and dangerous was unfolding around me. And Solace was both the key to understanding it and my protection from forces I couldn't see. I cried myself to sleep that night, but for the first time in a year, the tears weren't just about grief. They were about gratitude, about feeling chosen for something I couldn't name, but desperately wanted to be worthy of. The next morning, Solace saved my life. I was making coffee in my kitchen, running through my mental checklist for the day, when Solace began growling low in his throat. Not the warning growl of a dog sensing a threat, but something deeper, more urgent. He pawed at my leg, whined, then ran to the stove and back to me repeatedly until I followed him. The gas burner I thought I'd turned off the night before was still on, the flame invisible in the morning light. The kitchen was filled with natural gas, and if I'd flipped the light switch or struck a match for my morning candle, the fire department said another 30 minutes of accumulation could have killed me, or at least destroyed half my house. But Solace had known, had somehow detected the danger and made sure I understood. I looked at him differently after that, and he looked back like he'd been waiting for me to catch up to what he already knew. That's when I started researching the spiral pattern in earnest. What I found in obscure medical journals, archaeological reports, and conspiracy theory websites painted a picture that should have been impossible, but felt terrifyingly real. References to similar structures found in ancient carvings in Iceland, Mysterious implants discovered in people who'd been missing for years and returned with no memory of where they'd been. Even ultrasound images showing spiral formations in human fetuses. Pregnancies that always ended in stillbirth. All of these cases had one detail in common. Witnesses reported seeing unusual dogs in the area shortly before or after the discovery. Dogs that didn't behave like normal animals. Dogs that seemed to be watching, waiting, guarding something precious and dangerous. I was starting to understand that Solace wasn't just an animal with an unusual medical condition. He was part of something larger, something that had been happening for decades or maybe centuries, something that required guardians and witnesses and people willing to hold mysteries without demanding answers. 2 weeks after finding the first spiral, I ordered another X-ray. The structure in Solace's leg had grown, not dramatically, but measurably. New tendrils had extended toward his shoulder and down toward his paw. The bone had continued remodeling around it, and new neural pathways had formed. Whatever was inside him was still developing, still following some kind of predetermined pattern. But Solace showed no signs of discomfort. If anything, he seemed stronger, more aware, more purposeful with each passing day. The growth wasn't harming him. It was completing him. And that's when I realized the terrifying truth. The spiral wasn't a foreign object that had been implanted in him. It was a blueprint, an evolving template for something I couldn't understand but could no longer deny. Solace wasn't just carrying this structure. He was becoming it, or it was becoming him. On the 7th night after bringing him home, the power went out across the entire town. Not a rolling blackout or a grid failure, but a sudden, total silence that felt deliberate. I lit a candle and settled in to wait for the electricity to return, but Solace immediately moved to the living room window and stood rigid, every muscle in his body tense with attention. I followed his gaze into the darkness beyond my yard. There, at the edge of the woods that bordered my property, stood 3 figures. Too tall to be human, too still to be natural, too purposeful to be random. They didn't move or speak or make any attempt to approach the house. They just stood there, watching, like sentinels maintaining some kind of vigil. Solace growled, not from fear, but from recognition, like seeing old colleagues after a long absence. I clutched the X-ray images against my chest, suddenly understanding with crystal clarity that this had all been orchestrated. The limp that drew attention to his leg, the X-rays that revealed the impossible structure, the woman who came looking for him, even my decision to bring him home. None of it had been coincidence. This wasn't about treating an injured animal. It was about something choosing me, preparing me, awakening capacities I didn't know I possessed. The spiral in Solace's leg wasn't just changing him. It was a catalyst for changes in me, changes I was only beginning to sense. As I stood at my window, staring at those impossible figures in the darkness, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not physical, but fundamental. Like a door opening in a part of myself I'd never known existed. The real question wasn't what they had placed inside Solace. It was what they were awakening inside me, and whether I was brave enough to find out. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it touched you, please subscribe, leave your comment below, and know how grateful I am for having you here. Because some discoveries change not just what we know about the world, but what we know about ourselves. And sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple act of kindness toward a creature that needs our help.